To begin this video, I want to go ahead and switch from our watercolor to our acrylic media. And I want to point out to you that even though we have all the same settings here for our properties, as well as our brush modes that we can work with here, as what we saw with our watercolors, this is going to be significantly different from our watercolors in the sense that acrylic is going to have significantly thicker structure or body. You can think of this as the density of the paint. This is going to be very apparent to us when we're working with acrylics. So the very first thing that I want to do is I want to switch from a paper here, which is good for watercolors, to a canvas. It's going to be good for acrylics. So I'm going to come over here and choose the canvas texture of canvas, turn off the decal edges, and I'm also going to go ahead and choose an off-white color like so, and say OK, so that we have a canvas here. And then what I want to do is I want to come over and I want to make sure I'm viewing at 100% so I can really see the details of what's going on. And I'm going to choose the round brush. Now, just like what we saw with the watercolors, these sliders here are going to have a different impact on the different types of brushes. So if you're not getting the results that you want, it may be that the qualities of the brush itself are interfering with the results that you're trying to get, and the property sliders are not going to get you 100% of the way to where you want to be. Now, that said, the most important thing that we need to understand about the acrylics versus the watercolor is going to be the influence of the water slider. So I'm going to come over here and make sure that I have some tilt engaged for this. And I'm going to go ahead and choose something kind of like a middle gray blue, something like that right there, something to be very easy to see what's going on. And I'm going to go ahead and do a couple of things. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and lower the water down to a value of 1. So this is going to be a very dry acrylic paint. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here and I'm going to go ahead and begin to stroke down several strokes. And then I'm going to go ahead and stroke across those several strokes. And what I want you to see is that because this is very dry paint, we're able to see the brush strokes of the underlying layer through the brush strokes on top. Whereas if I come back over to something around 50 and I go ahead and I do the same thing again, so I'll go ahead and make these strokes, and then I'm going to go ahead and make strokes across them, you'll see that the strokes on top are going to wipe out the strokes underneath because this is a wetter paint. And if we were to go ahead and take this up to an even higher value of something like 69 and go ahead and make similar strokes, you're going to see that a number of things happen. So the first thing that happens is we're going to completely wipe out the strokes that are underneath. And the second thing that happens is you can see that some of the strokes themselves are going to kind of flatten a little bit. And this is going to become even more exaggerated as we increase the water. You can see that this is actually kind of flowing outward, and you can see that it's really just kind of self-flattening and becoming a fluid. And this is basically the influence of the water. Now, that said, if I come over here and I clear this real quick, and then I come over and I get some water, and I go ahead and pause the diffusion real quick, and I go ahead and lay down some water, and then I come back over here to our acrylic, and I have a lot of water in this acrylic, so I'm just going to view this. I'm going to go ahead and paint some of this acrylic down here at the edges. And you can see that even with 100 water, it has significantly less water in it than the water does. So it's not going to flow as much as watercolor does, even at a water value of 100%. But I'm going to go ahead now, turn off the view of the wetness and unpause. I'm going to allow this to diffuse. And you can see immediately that that water flows into the acrylic, and then it's going to allow that acrylic to flow down the page due to the tilt. So the idea here is that when we're working with this, we can allow this to drip, and we can even have some impact on it via the absorbency, edge darkening, canvas influence, and the drips as well. But at the end of the day, it's a thicker paint, so it's not going to drip and it's not going to move the same way that watercolor does. And it's always going to have a certain amount of thickness. Now, that thickness is something that we can control down here via the acrylic impasto depth slider, and we can do that at any point in time that we want to when we're painting. So if you don't like the look of the impasto, you can always just get rid of it by simply setting the impasto depth down to a lower value, or you could increase the impasto depth so that you see the impasto depth more. But the idea of working with the acrylics, like I said, is that it's very much related to watercolor in the sense that it has a lot of the same settings that have influence. And of course, you can cause it to flow using water. However, it's not really the same type of flow as what we're going to get with watercolor because it is a significantly thicker paint. And it's really meant for utilizing with structure. Now I'm going to go ahead and turn off the tilt. I'm going to come back over here to the navigator. And I'm also going to go over here and clear off this layer. And what I want to talk about now is how the other sliders are going to have an impact on what we're getting. So I'm going to set this back to 50. And then I'm going to come over here and I'm going to set the pressure lower, something around, say, 22 there. And what I want you to see is that having set the pressure lower, we're going to see more of that canvas texture appear, and it's not going to fill in the canvas as rapidly. However, if I come over here and I increase the pressure to say something around 74, you're going to see that it fills in that canvas texture very rapidly, and it also develops more structure. So this is going to be something that's going to affect the structure as well as the texture, and it's a little bit different than what we saw with watercolors. And if I set that back down to something close to 50, and I come over here to loading, this is going to be the actual structure of the paint, the thickness of the paint. So if I go ahead and increase this to 100, you're going to see that we get very, very thick paint. However, if I come down and I decrease it down to say something around 15, and I go ahead and I paint this down, you'll see we get very thin paint. It's not thin in the sense that we've added more water. It's thin in the sense that we don't see the same amount of structure. So if you wanted to reduce the impasto or reduce the intensity of the paint, you could reduce or increase the pressure or reduce or increase the loading in addition to modifying the water in order to get the results that you want. Now, there's one final thing that you want to take into consideration, and that's going to be, and I'll just come over here and reset the properties back to the default, is going to be how the water is going to impact the blending that we get when we're working in the normal mode. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here and I'm going to go ahead and just paint down a whole bunch of this blue. And now what I want to do is I want to go ahead and switch colors to say something like a red. And we're going to go ahead and blend. But before I do that, what I want to do is I want to come over here and I want to set the water down to 1. So we're using the normal brush mode. I've got the water set to 1. I'm going to go ahead and just scrub into this. And what I want you to see is that gradually we're losing that intensity of the red, but it's not blending into the blue as much as it might normally. If I come over here and I reset that back to 50, and I go ahead and make a similar mark, what you're going to see is that it's more rapidly going to blend into that, and you're going to see that it kind of becomes more harmonious. And then if I come over here and I increase that up to say something around 64, and I go ahead and make the same types of marks again, you're going to see that it does it even more thoroughly. You're going to see that it really blends in, and these are not as sort of separated as they were with these other two strokes. So when you're adding water, you're not just making the brush strokes sort of smooth out, but you're also increasing the smoothness of the blending, so the paint looks like it all belongs together and it was painted wet on wet. So if you want a wet on wet look, you would probably increase the water, whereas if you want a wet on dry look, you would probably decrease the water so that you could see the underlying strokes more clearly, and there's less of that smooth blending that makes its way into the paint. So again, like I say, it's very different from watercolors. It has a lot of the same property settings as watercolors, but at the end of the day, it's not really the same thing. So you do want to bear that in mind when you think about what you're getting when you're using the settings for acrylics versus what you're getting when you're using the same settings for watercolors.